Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talked to Sheree Curry, longtime journalist and former Jewfolk board member. We talk about the long and varied career she's had in the media, working on the Minnesota Commission of Judicial Selection, and how so much of her career has been at the intersection of race and Judaism on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we get started, be sure to check out some of the other podcasts that Jewfolk produces, like The Jews Are Tired, where Lev Gringaus is taking a deep dive into Jewish news, Kumba Hineni, Jewfolk's podcast on intersectionality with your host, Enzi Tanner. And if you're looking for a weekly dose of Jewish pop culture, check out The Bagel Report, produced by Jewfolk in partnership with Jay, the Jewish News of Northern California. Go to tcjewfolk.com/podcast to learn more. All right, 3, 2, 1. Sheree Curry, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me here.
So Sheree, we have known each other for a long time. I'm excited we're finally able to sit down because obviously, both of us working schedules can be really hard to zero in on a time. So I really appreciate that you're taking some time off and we're able to finally connect. So Sheree, again, we've known each other a long time. You've been on the board of Jewfolk. You were on the board of Jewfolk with me, 8-9 years ago?
2013, I think.
So 10 years, okay. So I think you joined
there a little bit before you, was I?
No, I think a little bit after.
A little bit after you?
So yeah, I joined in 12, you joined in 13.
Yeah.
You worked at Adath, we're Adath members as well. So we have sort of known each other and run in the same circles. You're a journalist by trade and training. You have taught, you have worked in communications, you have worked at newspapers. You've sort of had this very full, several very full careers, I jokingly said before we started recording, all wrapped into this one. Tell me a little bit about sort of the journey. Where did you initially find your love for journalism in the first place?
That's a great question. So I would say the love for journalism started as a child.
Okay. Same with me, so that's great.
Okay, yep. I started my elementary school's paper. So we didn't have one. So at that time, it was just a stapled together, photocopied. Actually, it was mimeographed, purple ink. And then I was on the high school newspaper as well. So I knew that I wanted to be a journalist, but did not go into journalism as a major in college.
Okay.
But I did join the campus paper, and that was with Daily Illini, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. But I went to graduate school for journalism. And so continued with the campus paper. Also started a Jewish magazine while I was on campus. So that was the first one for Hillel. We had a newsletter at Hillel. Mm-hmm. But then I started Devarim, so a magazine. So yeah, kept really busy, kept doing a lot of Jewish-related articles and race-related articles. And I remember one of my professors told me, because I also do it for some of my classes, you're kind of working on a big project, so you'll also do it as a paper for class.
Oh, absolutely.
And one of my professors told me, and actually he was a Jewish professor too, because said, you have to get out of your comfort zone. You're doing too much on black and Jewish stuff or black stuff, because I remember I interviewed, what's his name, Lester? The guy who wrote Love Song, black Jewish guy. Can't remember his name right now. But I remember I wrote that as a paper for a class, and he told me, time to get out of your comfort zone. So that's kind of how I kind of got into business journalism. So I ended up doing my master's thesis on small town business, Arcola, Illinois, the broom corn industry of America, which was still actually tied to my Jewish connections because the owner of Lippman Broom Company.
Oh, sure.
Jewish family there in the Urbana-Champaign, Arcola,
okay,
Illinois area. So used my connections and did a big interview with the owners of Lippman Broom Company, and just kind of the impact that the broom corn industry had on small town America. So that was kind of how my business journalism journey got started.
So people may not know, until they saw the picture that goes with this, that you are a Jew of color. How hard was it for you to sort of break out of, I mean, it's break out of that sort of, that place of the comfort zone and getting out of that? How hard was that for you?
I don't think that's, if you're good at being a journalist, it's not necessarily that hard. And granted, I was a student journalist, so I can't make a big claim, but I enjoyed, really it's about speaking to people and interviewing people and getting to know things. So that idea really wasn't too hard. But I would say it still never leaves you. Whatever your passion is or whoever you are is not going to leave whatever it is that you decide to do. So, for example, I did my internship while I was in graduate school at the Chicago Daily Defender, which is historically black-owned newspaper, created by Robert Sinstack at the time. So he was the founder of that. So again, I'm doing general stories,
Right.
but that's my internship. You're never going to really break away from that. I then, after graduate school, I moved to St. Louis with the intention of working for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which I had no job offer in hand. But I got a job at the Jewish Community Center in St. Louis, and I was freelancing for the Post-Dispatch. So I covered school board meetings, city council meetings, the typical, while working at the JCC in their communications office. So again, it's not going to really leave you. I was writing for the St. Louis, the Jewish Light, also
Sure.
the St. Louis Jewish Light, and then eventually got a job with a department that was a Pulitzer-owned department that was affiliated with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, but it wasn't the paper itself. It was like the early version of the internet. So I was a night editor for like an internet version of the paper. And from there, I went to Israel, and I wrote for Negev magazine, which was operated English language magazine for Ben Gurion University.
Oh, okay.
And I taught English at the university, and I taught 7th grade English in Omer, which happened to be the sister, later, many, many years later, it was the sister congregation for Adath.
Yes.
So I had that connection. So again, all of it's not leaving you. So when I was in Israel, I covered a lot of the Ethiopian community.
Oh,
so
okay.
that was around the time of the airlift, or right
So
after.
Operation Solomon.
Right,
Yep.
right. So I was a little bit after that, but still they're getting settled. So even though I still covered the Ethiopian community, also the Russian community that was immigrating there as well. So again, that whole race and culture thing never really left.
Right.
And my Jewish ties never really left anything that I did, but with that business training, just started to kind of do things that with a little bit more of an angle to that. So.
And I do love talking to people who are around my age who've worked in journalism for a long time and trying to, because I've also had to try to explain what the early days of the internet looked like in the newspaper world is such a weird concept now in 2023, but like 25, 26, 28 years ago is like a very different conversation to be had and trying to explain to people what it is and how the news business can work in the internet age.
Yeah, right.
Being on the forefront of that is a super weird thought now, but obviously it's so important. As obviously without that, there's probably no TC Jewfolk.
Right.
And mentioning Operation Solomon, if people want, shameless plug for some of the work that was written when I was in Israel in late April of a feature story on Senator Rudy Boschwitz, who was played an important role in Operation Solomon in helping the Ethiopian Jews out of Ethiopia and to immigrate to Israel. So the senator has a lot to say on that. So go catch up on that if you're interested. Shameless plug for my stuff. Okay, so when you came home, you have worked, Wall Street Journal. You had a column for 5 years there. You've worked as a freelance business writer, even in PR communications, in sort of the business area. What is it about business writing specifically that always really appealed to you? Because that's obviously a little bit different niche than a lot of other areas.
I have to tell a story about that because I was at the Fortune magazine before I did Wall Street Journal.
Okay.
And Actually, I'm going to go back one more step, because after Israel is when I was teaching. So you mentioned
Sure.
university. So, and that was at Drake University. I was tenure track journalism faculty there, and I was also the advisor to the Jewish Student Union, and I created a class on race and culture in the media as well. So again, it's never
It
going
never
to
leaves.
leave. It never leaves you.
Yeah.
But with the business journal, I would say being at Time Inc. and at Fortune Magazine was also a really good training. So I went there after Drake University, after teaching at Drake. And it's really like covering, everything else, but business drives everything. So again, you have the personality stories of, doing the profiles of CEOs or senior vice presidents, as well as the impact of, let's say it's retail, for example, the impact that has on us as consumers. So with your question was, I'm sorry, was what exactly, in terms of?
Oh, just in terms of business journalism as a sort of genre to find yourself writing in a lot, because obviously that's definitely, it just feels like an area that you just sort of kept gravitating to. And I agree with you that, like, if you can write anything. You don't need to have an MBA to be a business journalist. You just need to know how to ask the right questions. So, I mean, there had to have been something that was like special or appealing to you that really sort of kept pushing you back in that.
I would say, well, one thing would be maybe what wasn't of interest to me, which is I never consider myself a creative writer. So I always consider myself a reporter.
Yeah.
So to me, the creative writers were the ones, or the celebrity type writing, just writing for very different types of magazines.
Yeah.
So to me, I was very much so a reporter at heart. So digging into the numbers, and again, like I said, that impact on consumers and business that you can really identify with, because it is all around us in terms of what's driving us. So I would just say, really, maybe help in some degree was the push from the professor, right, to get out of your comfort zone. So that got me interested in the business journalism. Yeah, and it seemed easy enough to some degree. A part of business also is personal finance. And so I covered personal finance for a long time as well, in terms of like real estate industry, mortgages, tips for how to buy or sell your home. It could be savings tips for investing, or just saving your money to plan for that big European trip. So business is so broad. I was also like an editor at Advertising Age, just also looking at, I would spend days, just looking at ads on TV and writing about them and whatever. So business is really all around us. So it was very easy to me to be able to continue that when you start looking at everything from a business angle.
And everything, I think when you start looking at everything through a business angle or business lens, it can all filter through that lens. And so I think that's a really interesting way to be able to talk to people who do really anything, and it can all filter through that lens if you look hard enough for the way to tell that story.
Right. Everything is a business.
Which is, for better or worse, I suppose, that's how it is. We talked before we started recording how so much of what you do is sort of filtered through the intersection of race and religion and business and culture and all of those things. How have you seen that evolution take place? Has it always sort of been there, or is it just becoming a story that's told more now?
Well, I will say it has always been there. So how much attention and resources they're devoting to it is what has changed, as well as the change in the journalism industry itself, right? With the rise of the internet, which seems so odd to say now, because there are a whole generation of people like my son who that's all he knows. So to say the rise of the internet, but we remember when there was no internet with doing working as a journalist. So it makes it more prevalent, that there seems to be more stories out there. There are more stories definitely out there, but they're more accessible. So if I go back to, again, to Fortune magazine, for example, and Fortune is known for its list, right? The Fortune 500 list, the best companies to work for in America. I came up with the idea of the best companies for minorities to work for. It's since slightly renamed from how it was when I first came up with it. So that was something that we kind of talked about with some articles in terms of covering more diversity, but it wasn't a list at the time. So it was still a priority for companies, but how can we maybe help them elevate it in a sense? And that's how that list came about. If I kind of go with also with like advertising age, because I can remember we were doing a lot of stories on how to market to Black America, how to market to Latina America. And just to put that in context, that was the late 1990s. So it has been a topic that's been around for a long time. And so sometimes it can get to be a little bit frustrating because you say, it's been 20 years, it's been 30 years.
Right.
Why are we still talking about it in the way that we're talking about it today? How come we haven't gotten it right yet? But some companies are doing a lot of things right, but it is a matter of again how to grow those numbers. So when we look at some numbers in terms of percentages of demographic percentages, so 12-13% of in the U.S. are Black Americans, for example. So well, how come we don't have 12-13% on board of directors? How come we don't have 12-13% or even 10% or even 8%? In the C-suite of America's top companies. So those are the same stories that we've been telling for 20-30 years. So how can we get there?
Do you think that sort of ties into the state of race and diversity and DEI and that sort of thing in America and specifically corporate America today?
It definitely ties into it.
Okay.
So because we kind of go through these different waves. So you probably have heard some of the stories where we talk about the reporting of numbers that companies do. And if they do say, okay, we do have 13% or 25% of our workforce are people of color. But then we kind of dig into those numbers more, say, okay, well, these are the entry-level positions, or maybe there's some of the middle management positions, but they don't kind of go up the chain further than that. The broken rung, the glass ceiling, all the different phrases.
Yeah.
And so companies are trying hard, I do believe, and wanting to increase those numbers. But at the same time, there are certain initiatives that might be the first to get cut. Just like the arts in high school, right? Where when something has to get cut, that's where money gets cut. We've heard stories about that's the rise of the chief diversity officer in terms of focusing on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That was not a chief diversity officer was not a thing 30 years ago when I was at Fortune magazine. No. So that just the rise of that alone shows companies wanting to make more of an effort to how can they increase their numbers for recruitment and retention as well as promotion. But at the same time, it was chief diversity officer used to be a position that was reported, and in some companies still is, up to the human resources department. So now they're starting to get more of a seat that's actually being reported to the chief operating officer or to the CEO directly. So that makes a difference. They didn't always have staff, so sometimes the chief diversity officer was the only person really leading that whole department. So now they're starting to get more staff as well. So it is growing.
And especially with bigger companies, that's just not a one-person job.
It's definitely not a one-person job, but it was a one-person job for a
long time.
Sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I think if it's done right or discussed properly from the top down, it can become it becomes a corporate culture situation rather than a chief diversity officer go fix this situation.
Right. And you'll also see where a lot of, if the title isn't chief diversity officer, but vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion, whatever the title may be,
right,
where a lot of them, that was not their goal in life, right? It becomes something where, because you are a person of color, helping other employees, advocating for employees is kind of where that stems from. So people get tapped to rise based on that alone. So someone at the top says, I noticed that you're very active in our ERG, our employee resource group for Blacks or for Latinos, and then they kind of get tapped to rise. And for some people, when I was spoken to them at different companies, they were hesitant, right? They didn't go into this being, I don't want to be the advocate for everyone of my race. I don't, I'm doing it at a certain level to help my peers, but do I really want to speak for everyone from a top level?
Right.
But then they eventually, you're like, hey, it is still the C-suite or it's still a VP role,
Sure.
and they'll take it on, and know that it's needed. If we don't do it, who's going to do it? So,
and I think that's a really, I think, A, uncomfortable and B, unfair position to have to put people in, where it's like, you don't speak for all African Americans or all Jews or all Black Jews. I mean, just like, somebody would ask me a question about how do Jews feel about X. I'm like, that's way too complicated a question, because we all have our own opinions on things, and we all have our own ways of doing things. And it's like, it can't just be on me to answer for everyone. And frankly, nobody wants me to answer for everyone on anything. So and it's similarly, like, that's just not an okay position to ask you to be in.
But then if it becomes, you now have the ear, you're the intermediary, right? So listening to what it is that this particular group of employees want or need, and again, how can we recruit them, retain? I think here in the Twin Cities, for example, there was a group, I'm sure it still exists, called Make It MSP, which basically was a lot of our major companies getting together and saying, we're noticing that we recruit in people of color and they don't stay, right? They weren't necessarily born and raised here, right? So a lot of us are transplants. And so why are our employees of color leaving? What can we do?
Right.
And one thing that noticing when speaking to them and somebody's able to get that to the top is it's also the community outside of work as to why they're leaving. So if some people come and they're single, for example, they're not really finding a mate in town.
Yeah.
Or just the community, they didn't really know the area when they settled, and so they maybe didn't settle into a diverse enough area to feel at home. So there's a lot of reasons why they tend to leave. So like, okay, how can we fix this? So the Make It MSP was an example of, let's try to get professionals together of color and help them feel more welcome. So this kind of professional networking where they would also hear from top executives at U.S. Bank or Best Buy, Target, General Mills, et cetera. So,
and there's a lot of, not just Fortune 500, narrow it down, Fortune 100, Fortune 50 companies in the Twin Cities.
Yes.
We are a great community for those kind of companies to attract people to work into if they so choose.
Yeah.
So, one of the things we sort of chatted about beforehand was being a Jew of color in synagogues, and you've traveled. You've been in a lot of different states because of work. You've traveled, quite a bit. How have synagogues, how have you seen at least synagogues evolving, sort of how they talk about being sort of welcoming with respect to Jews of color? Because I feel like that's a conversation that's happening. It's been a more recent evolution in how it's discussed. And I don't know if that's something that you see as well, or.
I would say based on, because I'm the founder of blackandjewish.com, which at the time it was its own website, but now it's basically a Facebook group. And so I'm able to also hear from a lot of people around the U.S. and the world who are members of that. So things I think are changing. There are more open conversations about, again, I'm saying even retention of congregants, of color. Why do they stay, and making sure that they're welcome. I'll add though, I've been living in this. Actually, this is we're now April, so I have been here 20 years exactly, It was March 2003 when I
Okay.
moved to the Twin Cities. So this is the longest I've lived in any one place as I would say as an adult, but I think this is the longest I've lived in one place as
Period.
period. Yeah, yeah. So, but I have seen other synagogues. So, right, because I was in St. Louis at a synagogue. I was in New Jersey where I lived. Synagogue. I lived 3-4 doors down from the rabbi when I lived in. And the rabbi lived like one door from our synagogue when I lived in New Jersey, in Deal, New Jersey, and I'm also in Chicago when I was in Chicago as an adult as well. That I think everywhere that I've been personally, we're just speaking about how we can't speak for everyone.
Right.
Everywhere that I've been personally, I have felt very welcome everywhere that I've been, but based on what I'm learning from everyone else through the Black and Jewish group of other people who I've known through the years, there is now more open conversation, committee work in terms of what can we do to make people feel more welcome here, or making sure, and that feeling more welcome also just comes down to also kind of the opposite. Not say anything inappropriate so that they'll feel welcome.
Right.
So, and how can we help train everyone else? Because I can't remember in a lot of places where I lived where typically it was the much older generation who would come up to you with inappropriate questions of trying to figure out, who you are and why are you there.
Do you belong here?
Yeah.
Right.
All right, and then, or is your mother Jewish? Or whatever kind of questions they might
Yep.
ask. And so I would say that there's a lot less of that going on. It still happens,
Yeah.
but there's less of that through education. I think that synagogues have in terms of here's how maybe you can say something. Because we may do it with anybody, regardless of what race. When somebody's new in your synagogue, you want to welcome them. But when it's a person of color, be extra careful with how you might phrase
Right.
something. And I'll say Alec Adoth created the Anti-Racism Committee a couple years ago. Actually, and I'll add, unfortunately, since the death of George Floyd, a lot of synagogues, a lot of corporate America, everyone has kind of ramped up what more can we do, and it was an extra sense of urgency.
Yes.
So.
And which, I mean, you basically took the next question of, we are approaching very, very soon the 3rd anniversary of George Floyd's death in, May of 2020. And so I think it's unfortunate that it took an incident like that while it didn't, on one hand, it didn't directly affect the Jewish community in that George Floyd wasn't a member of the Jewish community, but there are Jews who live in the neighborhood, in the area where it happened. There are Jews who are Jews of color, who are Black Jews, who identify as lots of different things. And so therefore it does affect directly the Jewish community. And so it is, yes, it's something that probably should have been happening for longer, but sometimes, unfortunately, it takes something awful to start a conversation.
Right, and it's where we work, it's where we live, So it's not just the synagogues, but right, with Jews, we're out in the workplace as well. So anything that we can do helps us overall. I'll add that when we look at the differences of systemic racism, which is basically what that came down to, more companies, institutions paying attention to this is a systemic issue. What was going on, what happened with George Floyd. So even though we're looking at on the surface, it looks like, okay, it's a police and race issue, which it definitely is. But how do we get here? It really is still a systemic issue throughout every aspect
Right.
Of American life. So how can we address that? So you talk to almost any Black person, you're going to hear stories of how they were impacted one way or the other from a shopping while Black, driving while Black. It is there.
The profiling of walking down a crowded sidewalk
right.
while Black. I mean,
I can tell you a dozen stories of what have occurred
sure.
to me as well. So
I'm sure. How do you How do you talk to your son about that? How did you, or I'm sure, I mean, he's in college, he's older now, but like,
He's 20.
those are conversations that I'm sure you had to have with him from a fairly early age, unfortunately.
I would say I probably didn't as directly as some other people have said how they have set down their children, but indirectly, not the sitting down. I'm telling you, the birds and the bees versions of race in America. I didn't have that, but indirectly through stories that, like I'll give an example now. He has grown his hair out as long as all down his back, super long curly hair.
Okay.
And there are and he's very proud of his hair. so he gets lots of compliments, on his hair. But then he gets some people who, you should cut your hair, or your hair looks messy or whatever. And I had to have him sit and think about who are some of the people who are making the negative comments about your hair. Because you're going to probably find, when you think about that, it's going to be more people who don't understand ethnic hair, who thinks that your hair looks inappropriate. And so those kind of conversations, we would have. So that's the most more recent one I could think of.
Yeah.
But sure, there definitely were different stories or anecdotes. We kind of tell them individually as things would kind of occur.
So sort of relating to the, legal related world, I suppose, as close to a good segue as I could think of for this. You're in your second 4-year term for the Minnesota Commission of Judicial Selection, where you're part of the panel that interviews lawyers who want to become judges or judges who want to be elevated to the Court of Appeals. How did you initially get selected for that by Governor Walz?
That's actually an interesting story because I must say, in a way, I was kind of an advocate for wanting to see a change in the system of the court system.
Okay.
Because, it's not just the police, it's when people go to court and how they are treated differently when they are people of color. And particularly, I'm going to say African Americans. I mean, we know it's also Latinos, and it's in Minnesota for sure. It's also Native Americans. But there's a big discrepancy when it comes to African Americans in the court system as well. And it's at all levels. It's not just the criminal court system. And I would help some people write their as a writer. People would kind of come to you wanting to help them write anything. So people were writing their affidavits or whatever, and I would get tapped to do that. So I was, as a volunteer, help people for a few years with writing their affidavits, and through that work, someone came to me, a lawyer actually came to me and said, have you considered, or why don't you consider applying to be on this commission? My first reaction was, why would they pick me? Why would they pick me? And her response was, why would they not select you? And so it was very close to the deadline. And she actually called and reminded me the day of the deadline. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it. And part of my motivation really was, I am a strong believer that one person can make a difference. Mm-hmm. It's not going to be, it's a trickle, it's not going to be a big difference, but the whole thing, your one vote counts, every vote matters. So it's the same thing. So I went into it just hoping that if I can have some insight into who is selected as these judges, mm-hmm. that maybe I can help make a difference. Instead of making a difference in terms of just helping people with their affidavits, maybe on this other level. So I can't say I have achieved everything that I had in my mind because the system's always worked that way.
Right.
But I was still surprised that I was selected. There, for the commission, I don't remember the exact breakdown, but it's, a set number by statute of how many lawyers have to be on the commission and then how many non-attorneys will be on the commission.
Got it.
And then it's also broken up with judicial district. So Hennepin County, for example, is the 4th judicial district. So there's so many people from Hennepin County who will be selected. There's so many from 2nd judicial district, 10th judicial district, et cetera. I'm an at-large member, so outside of an individual district, it means I'm on the commission for all the districts throughout the state of Minnesota.
Okay.
And so one thing that's also written in the statutes is for the governor to consider gender and race when selecting applicants. So it doesn't mean that those are the only ones you're selecting, but it is a priority. And I think for a lot of, again, businesses, and we look at the government as a business,
Sure.
you have to build in some kind of a metric where how are you going to prioritize this? It can't just be, we know we want to hire more people of color, but if you don't actually make it a priority, it's not going to happen half the time. So so there is that kind of eye towards that with being on that commission, and we're looking at the resumes with that lens, but also the lens of balancing the number of people with criminal defense backgrounds, your prosecutors versus private practice.
Right.
There's a variety, right? Everything has to be, there's a diversity in everything, right? So kind of diversity of practice that's going to be on the bench in terms of where they come from, as well as I'm going to even say to some degree, would definitely there's the gender one, but as for me as a non-attorney on there, because again I can't speak for everybody in how they look at when they're judging who they want to vote for, but I always want to think back to the people who I was helping with their affidavits. A lot of them were people who couldn't afford attorneys. So they would be going into court pro se without an attorney, a lot of them. And so it was, do I think that this attorney who's applying to be a judge, how considerate are they going to be of that person standing in front of them who does not have attorney representation? So that comes into an economic diversity, a socioeconomic diversity as well. So, and yeah, so there's a lot of reasons as to kind of why I wanted to do it, and hoping that I'm helping to make a difference.
I mean, empathy matters, right? I mean, like, understanding, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, that matters. I think that's helpful, and you can do that and apply the law at the same time.
Right.
But having a balanced bench when it comes to the judiciary is as important to having balanced C-suite as in the business world too. So I think that is absolutely the right way to be looking at it. So it's 4-year terms. How many terms can you serve?
Well, that's also a good question. So some of the people on the commission are appointed by the governor.
Okay.
Some are appointed by the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Oh, okay.
And so I believe there's a term limit if you're appointed by the court. I don't think there's a term limit if you're appointed by the governor.
Okay.
So.
And is it a nonpartisan position?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, it's important work, and I think if there's one thread that people have picked up is that it all sort of, the intersection of race and religion and culture and business, it's just yet another thread that ties through your real, the varied career that you've had so far.
Yeah.
Well, Sheree, last couple questions, and we will let you get on with your day. First, what is your favorite? You're hiding, so you know it's coming, and you don't want to answer these, but I have to ask you. What is your favorite Jewish holiday?
I would say there's always a two-part answer to this. I hear everybody else's, and they can never say just one.
No.
Simchas Torah was always my favorite.
Okay.
Just the dancing with the Torah. When I was younger, I used to have a skirt that I would wear every Simchas Torah. That was my skirt for Simchas Torah. I would also say to some degree that my second choice is Pesach. Everyone else kind of says that, but for a different reason, I would say.
Okay.
Also tying in the whole Black and Jewish thing, I used to hold African American seders. So with any Jewish friend, but there would be like an African American theme to it. So we're talking about Egyptian slaves, I would tie in American slavery as well. So I had written actually a whole Haggadah on it based on research. So,
Wow. Oh, that's very cool and important. And I think I love that is a new explanation. I mean, I always ask why, and there's always, everybody's answer is unique on it, but like this is definitely a different area that hasn't been explored yet.
tie race into everything. That's what I do. That's what I do.
Everything. What is your favorite Jewish food?
I knew this was coming. So when I was thinking about this answer before, my mind went first to falafel, but I'm a very particular about my falafel.
Okay.
So it cannot be extra crunchy.
Okay.
Through like overcooked. So I think about there was a falafel stand in Israel when I lived there, a place called Beta Ful, and they had the best falafel. I'm always trying to find one that is like that, where there were larger falafel balls,
Okay.
moist in the inside, and just that little bit of crunch.
But not
on the
overcooked.
outside. Not overcooked, and not too small, because when they're too small, they taste oily.
And it's easier to overcook them.
Yeah.
It's easier to overcook them when they're smaller. Absolutely. Well, Sheree Curry, thank you so much. I am glad that after 5+ years now of this podcast, we are finally able to sit down and make this happen. I appreciate your time and your energies and all of what you've done, especially the contributions. Personally, your contributions to Jewfolk and helping it become what it has over the years. So thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network, a product of Jewfolk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.